Welcome everyone to the webinar. I'd like to first begin with an acknowledgement of country. I respectfully acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land on which I stand and am hosting from today. In the spirit of reconciliation, NEABPD Australia acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders attending today. My name is Belinda and I will be your host today. I work and volunteer for NEABPD Australia on the admin side of things, and I'm also a trained Family Connections volunteer leader. NEABPD Australia is a not-for-profit organisation delivering programs, webinars and events to support families, carers and people in a relationship with someone who has BPD or BPD traits. And that's whether there is a diagnosis or not. Our main offering is the Family Connections program, which is a free evidence-based 12-week program delivering psychoeducation, skills, training and support for people who are caring for or in a relationship with someone who has BPD. Today, we are so grateful for a presentation from Professor Penelope Hasking from Curtin University. Penny has written a book on self-injury recovery and has focused her research on mental health among adolescents and young adults. She has a strong interest in the experience of self-injury with a focus on topics such as stigma, disclosure, scarring and recovery. She takes a person-centered view to better understand self-injury and advocate for individuals with lived experience. Thank you so much, Penny, for making the time for us and our audience. Welcome.
Thank you, Belinda. Thank you for inviting me to do this. This is my bread and butter. I could talk about it for days. So we'll see how far we get today, but I'm more than happy to take any questions or to be emailed afterwards if anyone has any follow-up. I'll share my screen so that you can see my slides. So hopefully you can see those there. Yep, great. So I would also like to begin with an acknowledgement of country and to acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people who are the traditional owners of the land on which I work, and also pay my respects to the Indigenous peoples and First Nations peoples of the lands on which you're all sitting on today. I would also like to acknowledge individuals with lived and living experience of self-injury or caring for somebody who self-injures, and to acknowledge their stories that have really informed a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today. So I always like to start just by making sure that we're all on the same page when we're talking about self-injury. The term self-harm is one that's used more often in Australia. So try to make that distinction between self-harm and self-injury so we're all talking about the same thing. So self-harm is a very broad term, refers to any self-inflicted damage to the body regardless of intent. So this means that it includes NSSI or non-suicidal self-injury, includes poisoning, includes suicide attempt, risky behaviour like reckless driving, drug use, that might include eating disorders, for example, but also culturally sanctioned behaviour like body piercing or tattooing. So it's a very, very broad range of behaviours that come under that term of self-harm. When we talk about NSSI or non-suicidal self-injury, we're talking about behaviour that's deliberately engaged with the intent to hurt body tissue or damage body tissue with no conscious suicidal intent. So usually we think of this as cutting, burning, self-battery, but the methods really vary, based on somebody's imagination. It's really not limited to sort of the top three. We like to make this distinction between self-injury and self-harm because the predictors, the underlying mechanisms, the behaviours themselves and the outcomes are very, very different. And I think you'd agree that we would treat somebody who, I wouldn't treat, but approach somebody who has tattoos and body piercing very differently from somebody who has tried to take their life. So certainly from a research perspective, we try to narrow down our definition into something quite specific in talking about NSSI that excludes suicidal behaviour, excludes drug use, excludes eating disorders, And we also tend to exclude any damage to body tissue that might occur as a result or as a symptom of pervasive developmental disorders or neurodiversity. So repetition behaviours tend to be excluded. Just some basic stats around self-injury. We report about 1 in 5 adolescents and about 5% of adults will report a history of self-injury at some point in their lifetime. And these results are consistent across most of the Western world, so US, Canada, Australia, UK, and Europe, but we're seeing emerging data come out of Asia that reports the same numbers. So they're fairly consistently reported. Most often engaged in early adolescence, sort of a peak onset around 12 to 14 years of age, but there's a second peak age of onset around 20 years of age. So these are often university students who are struggling with university, and we see around 10% of university students will start to self-injure for the first time in that first or second year of university. It's equally common among males and females. And although stereotypes seem to suggest that, you know, this is sort of adolescent girls, the data doesn't bear that out. We do know that girls and women are more likely to seek treatment, so they're overrepresented in the treatment-seeking statistics. They're more likely to engage in forms of self-injury that are more visible. So boys and men are better able to cover up the self-injury. And we do know that it's associated with borderline personality disorder, which tends to be diagnosed more often amongst women. So that might be where we start to see some differences in those rates. But when we look at community samples in general, there's really no difference in the number of boys and men or girls and women who self-injure. To bust another myth, the rates of self-injury in the population don't seem to have actually increased since the 90s, which is when we got the first real data on how many people self-injure. We do talk about it a lot more. We're much more open to recognizing self-injury, to talking about it. We see it a lot more in media and in music, TV series, but the actual rates of how many people are engaging in the behavior hasn't seen that sharp incline. So while I'm talking about addressing myths, some of you are going to know these already. As I mentioned, boys and men are just as likely to engage in self-injury as girls are. It's not about attention seeking or being manipulative. It's usually about coping and trying to manage with life. As I said, we define self-injury as excluding suicidal behavior. So by definition, non-suicidal self-injury is not about suicide and is often a way to manage suicidal feelings or to escape from suicidal feelings. It's also not a fad. We see a lot of people who might start to self-injure during adolescence and then continue through the rest of their lives. Most people will stop engaging in self-injury as they move out of adolescence. But as you might have seen on the previous slide, there was one large epidemiological study in Australia where the latest age of onset was over 65. So the point I'm trying to make is that people of all ages, all genders, all ethnicities can report a history of self-injury or be engaged in self-injury. The last point there is an important one. Historically, self-injury has been tied to BPD. It may be one diagnostic criterion, but it's not sufficient for a diagnosis. It's not necessary for a diagnosis. And we see many, many more people who self-injure who do not meet criteria for BPD. So as a field, we've been trying to put a lot of work into saying, you know, we have to separate diagnosis and behavior. We're talking about a coping strategy that people with a range of different mental health conditions report, and about 20% of people with chronic self-injury don't meet criteria for any mental health disorder at all. Belinda mentioned that we like to take a very person-centered approach to understanding self-injury. And I guess one of my key messages when I do talks like this is, you know, I can throw statistics at you, I can throw averages at you, but at the end of the day, it's about the individual person who's sitting in that room. What's going on for them at this time? What are their reasons for engaging in self-injury? What are their patterns? What do they need right now? As I mentioned, self-injury is usually about coping. So it's a means of managing emotion. usually intense emotions, not always negative emotions. There are people who also struggle with intense positive emotions or sitting with uncertainty or frustration. Also to use a form of self-punishment. So a lot of people will self-injure as a means of attacking themselves, that they feel bad, they feel unworthy. We've been doing some work with trans young people who will report self-injuring as a way of attacking their body, particularly body parts that they feel uncomfortable with or don't like or don't feel that they belong. Self-injury can also be used as a form of communication when other means of communication have failed. So that might mean that somebody doesn't have the language to express how they feel, that they struggle to describe what's going on for them, that they've tried to communicate to people in the past and felt misunderstood, and they might use self-injury as a way of communicating the psychological pain that they're in. So there are a host of other reasons, but these are really the top reasons that come out most of the time. What I wanted to spend maybe half this presentation on is looking at a new way to conceptualize self-injury recovery. And then the second part of the talk, I'll focus more on parents and caregivers and the impact on families and what families can do to support people who self-injure. And when I talk about parents and caregivers, I'd like to consider that as a very, very broad definition. So I'm also talking about peers, romantic partners, siblings, children of people who self-injure. So I apologise for using a shortcut of parents and carers, but I do mean that in the most inclusive manner possible. So Belinda mentioned a new book I have out, and I'll be doing a shameless plug for that later on. But one of the core chapters in this book, we talk about NSSI recovery. And this framework, we believe, provides a paradigm shift in the way that we think about NSSI recovery. When we ask people what recovery means to them and how they know they would have recovered, a lot of the responses we get are when I don't self-injure anymore, or when I don't think about it anymore. When we look at medical models of self-injury, it's about stopping the behaviour. And basically saying you don't self-injure anymore, therefore you're recovered. What we found in talking to people who self-injure is they may well say, I'll be recovered when I stop thinking about it. But in the very next breath, they'll say, yes, I've had ongoing thoughts and urges to self-injure for ages, even though I haven't acted on it. So we thought it was quite unrealistic and sets people up for failure to say you're not recovered until you stop thinking about it, or you're not recovered until you stop self-injuring. So within this framework, we wanted to take that person-centered approach and draw on the work that we've done with people with lived experience to represent what it's like for an individual who self-injures. What are the themes that are pertinent to them? What are the aspects that go into their recovery experience, and move away from the focus on just stop the behaviour. So you'll see in this framework, stopping the behaviour is not actually in there. That doesn't mean that it's not a worthwhile goal, but our focus is on all of the other experiential things that go along with that. So I'm going to go through each of these individually and sort of look at what each of them looks like. But I guess one of the take-home messages is that recovery is an ongoing, non-linear and individual process. Other sort of medical models of recovery have a very staged approach, where you might be thinking about behaviour change, and then you put some plans in place to change behaviour, then you try to change behaviour, and then you're recovered. We say it doesn't work in that linear fashion. People could be at any point in this model at any time. So for some people, navigating disclosure of self-injury might be really important for them right now, whereas finding alternatives to self-injury isn't a high priority. Not all of these will have pertinence to everyone who self-injures. So we do bear in mind that it is a very individualized approach. And as I said before, working or supporting the person who's in the room with whatever is going on for them right now and what is important to them right now. So when we talk about realistic expectations and setbacks and normalizing thoughts and urges, this really reflects that non-linear process, that it's going to go up and down. that thoughts of self-injury may never fully go away. They are likely to reduce in frequency and intensity over time. But it's not uncommon, particularly if someone's going through a particularly stressful time, that those thoughts will come back again. What we focus on is how people approach those thoughts and how they manage those thoughts. So we don't want to set people up to say, if you think about self-injury, then obviously you haven't recovered, or obviously this is bad. That's normal. Okay? Everyone who self-injures has ongoing thoughts and urges. So we try to set that up as a realistic expectation. And also in setbacks. So people will return to a trusted coping strategy in times of stress. So they may have gone quite some time without self-injuring, and then they have a bad week and they go back to self-injury because they know that's worked. That's, again, a normal process in that recovery journey. So we try not to punish people for that, try not to get judgmental or suggest that somebody's not made progress because they've self-injured again. So to help set these expectations and normalize those thoughts, we talk about reframing instances of self-injury. So it might be, it's just a one-off. This doesn't mean I'll continue to self-injure, whatever language people find helpful for them. It's just a setback. I'm still making progress in other areas. I'm still learning how to cope in other ways. And I'll talk about the difficulty of that a little bit later on, that finding new alternatives is hard. And we need to acknowledge that, and that it takes time and it takes practice. I've been really good at resisting urges lately. This one slip doesn't diminish that. So we're still recognizing progress people have made. Or this was a particularly overwhelming situation, so it's not surprising, but I have other strategies I can use when the emotions are less intense. So this is really borrowed from the drug and alcohol literature, where they distinguish between a lapse and a relapse. So if somebody has been abstinent for a while and hasn't been drinking, and then they have a lapse, there may be a tendency to have what we call the abstinence violation effect, which is just big words for saying, well, I've blown it now, I may as well keep drinking. And what we try to do is reframe that and say, well, no, this is just one slip up. There's a lot of progress along the way. Get back on the wagon tomorrow and keep working on what you've been working on. So it's the same kind of idea, that this is just one slip up. I've made a lot of progress in other areas. I'm still trying to learn how to cope. I'm going to get there eventually. Another thing to consider in that normalization of setbacks and normalizing thoughts and urges is the ambivalence around self-injury. And this is something that there's very little research on. I think we've got half a dozen papers or so on this. It's a very new field to look at. But we find, when I talk to healthcare workers, when I talk to parents and caregivers, people can become quite frustrated when they have a client or a loved one who's saying, no, I really do want to stop, but they keep self-injuring. It's like, but you say you want to stop, why are you still self-injuring? And that can be very confusing for people who aren't living in that situation. And what's often occurring is this idea of ambivalence, of people who see the downsides of self-injury. They see the impact it has on their family and friends. They see the physical effects of scarring, if that's something that is pertinent to their method of self-injury. But at the same time, they don't want to give up that coping strategy. Some people refer to self-injury as a friend. It's kind of their blanket of support and what they turn to when they're distressed. So there's a very clear weighing up of, yes, I do want to stop. I can see the downside, but I also want to hold on to it or keep it in my toolbox. One of the studies we did recently with people who hadn't self-injured for quite some time, a lot of them were saying, yes, I feel I've recovered from self-injury. Yes, I still think about it, but it's not that frequent, not that intense, but I haven't self-injured for a while. I consider myself recovered. We asked them if they could ever see a situation in which they would self-injure again. And all of them said yes. So even though they themselves felt healthy at the time, they felt that they didn't need self-injury right now, but they could all foresee a time when it might happen again. So it was still kind of in their toolbox at the time. So I think it's important to acknowledge that and to say, look, I know this is difficult. It's hard to give up something that works. So, if we're honest about it, self-injury is an incredibly effective coping strategy. It's accessible, it's cheap, it's fast. there's some research out there that says, why don't more people self-injure? So I think we need to acknowledge that people self-injure for a reason. People don't do it just for no reason whatsoever, that it does serve a function. And thus there can be this ambivalence of, yes, I do want to stop, but at the same time, I'm scared of doing that. Another aspect of our person-centered framework is moving away from deficit-based medical models of self-injury. Much of the original work around self-injury was focused on deficits or lack of skills that people who self-injure might have. So we talk about a lack of coping strategies, a lack of emotion regulation, an inability to cope, for example. And we move away from that language to say, sure, building coping strategies and building emotion regulation is a great thing, but every single person who self-injures also has incredible strengths. Why don't we focus on those? Why don't we harness the strengths people have to empower them to get some positive reward in their day, to be able to highlight the good things that they're doing? And there are a number of ways that we can do this. So strengths could be a good social support network. It could be academic performance. It could be in the arts or sports or, achievement-based kind of stuff. But we can also look at core virtues that people have. So things like wisdom and knowledge, courage, humanity, justice, temperance, transcendence. So these are kind of high-level virtues that people hold. And these can translate into things like a great sense of humor. It could be generosity towards others. It could be kindness towards others. So any one of these things can be harnessed to say, wow, you have a great sense of humor. That's a real asset that you have. You make me laugh. I find that wonderful. That's a real strength that you have, something that we can use. So there are a number of inventories out there that list these kinds of character strengths, and people can rate to what extent they possess each of them. Obviously, not everyone is going to have all of these, but it allows you to sort of support somebody who self-injures in a much more positive way than trying to focus on what can often be a really challenging and tricky behaviour. It could also be used as a way of finding some alternatives to self-injury. And again, I'll talk about that in a little bit, but there might be activities that link to some of these character strengths. So for example, if somebody has a love of learning and is curious, then when they're having a tough day, maybe they want to go learn something new, to get online and research something. And that might provide a bit of a distraction and a bit of fun for them that might reduce the intensity of that feeling. From the positive psychology literature, we see this PERMA model, which stands for positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishments. And again, it's got this very positive spin on it of, let's stop focusing on everything that's wrong and enhance some of the things that we're doing really well. So savoring times you feel happy. When I talk about building self-efficacy, we talk about some of this as well. But have there been times somebody has not self-injured? Have there been times they've not acted on that urge? What happened then? What was different then? Can we savor and reward not acting on that urge? Even if they continue to self-injure, if there's times when they have not acted on that urge, to reward that rather than focusing on the times that they have self-injured. Becoming completely absorbed in activities. So again, this might go back to strengths. It might go back to interests people have in nature, in art, in relationships, in socializing with people, in listening to music, whatever it might be, to be fully absorbed in that moment. Connecting with other people is important. With self-injury, it can be a double-edged sword in that sometimes interpersonal conflict is actually one of the main drivers of self-injury. So we need to be a little bit careful around interpersonal conflict. But having people who are non-judgmental and supportive and understanding is really important to help people who self-injure to work through some of the stuff that might be leading into self-injury. Finding meaning or purpose and celebrating successes. So looking at setting very small goals. Somebody might want to become more physically healthy. We don't set out to say, okay, I'm going to run the Boston Marathon next week. We start with, can I put the runners on? Okay, great, let's reward that. And then it might be a walk around the block, and then it might be a jog around the block. So we want to set up meaningful and realistic goals that don't set people up for failure, that we can then build on and reward those successes as they occur. In the context of self-injury, this might be something like getting on better with siblings. It might be being more engaged in household activities, doing the dishes or doing the laundry or making dinner. It depends on whatever your situation is. There are lots of little opportunities to reward somebody for making an effort, even if there's no active behavior change yet. Okay, finding alternatives. So as I said, this is really, really hard because self-injury is very effective. And giving that up takes a lot of time and a lot of effort, and it can be really scary. And people will say, but what do I do without self-injury? If we take away somebody's coping strategy, they've got nothing left. And that can be terrifying. So I like to think about finding alternatives in 3 different ways. First of all, it's about trying to reduce the urge to self-injure in the first place. So how do we do that? Maintaining physically and healthy lifestyle, eating well, exercising well, sleeping well, all the usual, how to live a mentally and physically healthy life is going to help reduce some of the intensity of emotions, emotional reactivity, impulsivity, and reduce the urge in the first place. I think a big key to this is increasing emotional awareness. A lot of people with self-injury, as I said before, struggle to identify or articulate how they're feeling. They don't necessarily have the language to explain how they're feeling. I might be feeling crappy, but I couldn't tell you what crappy looks like or how that feels. Increasing that emotional awareness can be really important for recognizing when an urge might be starting or when they're just not traveling well today. Some work in this space monitored people who self-injure over a couple of weeks and gave them random assessments several times a day throughout those couple of weeks to ask, were they feeling any positive mood? Were they feeling negative mood? Were they feeling an urge to self-injure? Where were they physically? Were they with other people? What was going on for them at that time when they got that beep on their phone to answer the questions? And what that found is that we could map an increase in negative mood 8 hours before somebody self-injured, but they only reported the urge to self-injure 1 hour before. So there's 7 hours where the participants in this study were sort of gently simmering and the negative mood was going up, 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 up and up until they got to the point where self-injury occurred to them. So there's 7 hours of possible intervention time there. If we can help people, support people to recognize that their negative emotions are going up, or that their irritability or their frustration or sense of overwhelming or whatever it might be is starting to rise, starting to get on that boil, then we can put strategies in place to say, okay, I'm feeling a bit irritable today. I know I need to take care of myself. I need to go for a walk. I need to listen to some music. I need to do whatever strategy is going to help bring that simmer back down so that the urge doesn't get to that intense level. So I'm not saying that's easy, but I think that's one of the key things in trying to support somebody who self-injures, is try to get in there early before that emotional response becomes so intense that self-injury is the only answer. Coming back to this idea of reappraising self-injury, normalizing thoughts and urges, we encourage people to, as I said before, accept that urges are normal. Okay? A lot of people, when they experience an urge, will get angry at themselves. Why am I doing this again? Why am I thinking this again? I've been doing so well. Or, I promised somebody I wouldn't self-injure. Why do I feel this way? What's wrong with me? We need to normalize that and say, actually, you're in a pretty crappy situation right now. It's not surprising that you have this urge. It's what we do with that urge that is important. So we can reappraise it and say, just because you're thinking something doesn't mean you need to act on that. So thoughts and urges are going to come and go. It doesn't mean you necessarily need to act on them. If we sit with that urge, then over time it will dissipate. And we refer to urge surfing, where it really is like a wave, where the urge gets more and more and more and more intense, and over time it will dissipate and roll like a wave does. So some people find visualizing that helpful, to be able to sort of go, okay, I'm having this urge. It's not unexpected. I've had a pretty crappy time. Some people will say, okay, I'll wait 10 minutes before I self-injure. And during that time, they might distract themselves, or they might feel that urge come down a little bit. Obviously, that's not going to work for everyone all the time. It's going to depend how rapidly that wave comes up. But that's one strategy that does work for some people. Then, of course, we have the sort of in the moment alternatives. So what can people do instead of self-injuring? They haven't been able to resist that urge. What else can they use? Distraction seems to be the one that works most for most people. So doing something else, being in a room with other people. So people self-injure most often on their own in private. If they can come into the lounge room and sit with the family, or put on a video to watch with siblings, that could be a distraction that gets them out of their head in that time. But it's important that those alternatives are matched to the intensity of that urge. So, for example, if somebody is able to catch their negative mood early in the morning, for example, and go, this is a red letter day, put some strategies in place, treat myself to a nice lunch, go for a walk on the beach, and have a cup of tea and calm down. Those strategies are not going to work when somebody's feeling that really intense urge. So when it's a really intense urge, it might be jump in a cold shower, pour a bucket of cold water over your head, which actually changes the physiology, gives the arousal system a sort of electric shock to automatically regulate the physiology and the physiological arousal that goes with that highly intense emotion. So we talk about urges on a scale from 1 to 10, say. So if somebody's at that point of 10, it might be that intense kind of snap, cold shower moment, which might bring people down to an urge of 8. At an urge of 8, it might be something like exercising to the point of exhaustion, and it might be dancing around the apartment like an absolute lunatic, something that's kind of high energy and is going to use up some of that, intense feeling. And that might get somebody down to a 5. And then when they're a 5, they might want to do something distracting or call a friend, or do something a little bit less intense that, they can still find a way to cope with that urge. Okay? And then they might come down to a 2, and then they might have a cup of tea and read a book. So I hope that makes sense, how the different strategies might be matched to how intense that urge is, and how we're not going to say to somebody who's in that intense phase, it's okay, just go and have a cup of tea and you'll be fine. That's not going to work. One thing that I haven't mentioned on these slides, I don't think, is the replacement behaviors that some people recommend, like snapping a rubber band or drawing red lines on the skin. We don't advocate for those. There's no empirical evidence they work, but there is empirical evidence that they don't work. And there's actually a beautiful paper called "These Things Don't Work," where colleagues in the UK interviewed people who self-injured and about their thoughts about these behaviours. And they reported that the replacement behaviours can often do more damage than whatever method they usually self-injure with. Lost my train of thought on that one. But the third point I was going to make is that people often find it infantilizing and demoralizing when somebody says, oh, instead of cutting, why don't you just draw a red line on your arm? And it's like, no, that's a very clear sign that you have no idea what's going on. And it's a very clear misunderstanding of what that experience of self-injury is like. So we don't recommend them as a first line of defense. That's what I was going to say before. The second point is that's basically suppressing the emotion. It's basically trying to turn down the emotion, pretend it's not there, and resist acting on that urge. And we know that when we suppress emotion, there's a rebound effect. So you suppress, and then it rebounds to a higher intensity than it was before. So then people may self-injure more seriously than they intended to, because that level of intensity is much higher. So they were the 3 things that came out in that paper of, they can be used to self-injure more severely. They can result in increased self-injury or more severe self-injury. And it's really not a person-centered, respectful way to approach somebody who self-injures. Having said that, I'll come back to my point about supporting the person in the room and what they need at the time. So some people do find these strategies helpful. So that's not to say if they find them helpful that we're going to take them away, just that we wouldn't recommend them as a first line of defense. Another thing people can use in terms of finding alternatives or supports to help resist urges to self-injure is a support plan. This comes from the suicide prevention literature, where they use safety planning as a gold standard for keeping somebody safe when they are in a suicidal crisis. We take the same kind of methodology, but frame around self-injury rather than suicidal ideation. So there are a number of apps online where you can download safety plans and write your responses into the app so that people have the app on their phone at all times. Because we know when that urge gets really intense, there doesn't seem to be like there's any other alternative. Trying to think of things that have worked in the past, trying to think of alternatives is very difficult because you kind of get a tunnel vision of I have to self-injure, that's the only thing that's going to work. So having this plan on hand means that people don't need to think what works before. They don't need to try and cast their mind back to some other strategy. They have it already written on their phone. So we ask questions about warning signs. So how do I know I'm heading into a time I might self-injure? And this might be that early emotional awareness, that 7 hours before self-injury, where we go, hang on, I'm feeling a bit off today. Is this a day where I might be at higher risk? What do I need to do to support myself today? So it might be I'm stressed at work. My clue is always snapping at one of my colleagues, one of my friends at work, unnecessarily. We have a very close relationship and we're great friends, but when I start nagging him and snapping at him, I'm like, okay, I need to calm down. Something's going on here. So whatever it is for whoever the person is that you're supporting, everyone's going to have their own little warning signs of, yeah, today just feels a bit off. My reasons not to self-injure. So again, that can be quite difficult to remember when that urge is really intense. So it might be my friends will be upset. I don't want any more scars. I don't want to lose control. So people may use self-injury as a way of enacting control, but at the same time, don't want to feel like they're controlled by their self-injury. Writing down alternatives. So what are some strategies that have worked in the past? And so, as I said, they can bring their phone up at the time and say, oh yes, I forgot that, you know, playing with the dog helped me when I was at a level 6 urge. Support networks, so who's around that I can call and have a chat to, and then we have professional supports or emergency supports if that's required. In terms of the apps that are available, I would recommend the Beyond Now safety planning app. So that's one that's put out by Beyond Blue. It is safety planning around suicide, but as I said, you can reframe that to write any responses you want into those questions that are self-injury specific, in which case we'll call it a support plan or a coping plan rather than a safety plan. So individuals can do this by themselves. They can download the app themselves and fill it in. They can do it with a family member or a friend. They can do it with a health professional. Sometimes people who self-injure can't identify alternative strategies, and it's the people who are around them who can go, but hang on a minute, last time you went for a walk, you came back feeling much better. Is that something you might want to try next time? So you can work together to build that, and you can share your plan with other people. So it may be that somebody's feeling particularly distressed and a family member or friend has a copy of their plan, and they can go, hey, we did this plan together. Remember, these are some of the things you identified. Do any of those seem to work right now? I noticed somebody in the comments asked about scarring, and addressing and accepting scarring is part of our recovery framework. So again, we really take a lived experience view through this framework of what it's like to be somebody who walks around as somebody who self-injures. And that's why we see a lot of things in the framework that clinicians and scientists usually ignore. They're so focused on risk factors and predictors and treatment that they forget that there's an individual person, many of whom do have scarring. Not all, but some will have scarring. And there are feelings and emotions and cognitions around that, and there's management of visibility of scars depending on where they're located on the body and how people manage that. And that can take up a lot of time for somebody who has extensive scarring. So we asked individuals, or a colleague of mine actually did this work, asking people what they thought of their scarring. And there were a number of different responses. So like everything, I'm going to say, you know, there's no tried and true black and white. It really depends on the individual in the room. Some people said their scars are like their story. They remind them of what they've been through and how strong they've had to be. Some people hate their scars. So you get this real kind of dual, I hate them, I see them as a sign of strength. Some people feel shame associated with their scarring because it reminds them that they've self-injured, while other people see them as a sign of resilience and that they've managed to get through a tough time. We see acceptance of scarring as a process that is going to change over time, but it's one that we like to support people through and recognize is a process rather than trying to ignore them or cover them up and just not talk about it. And I've talked about ambivalence, so that can refer to the scarring as well, that they love them, hate them at the same time. I thought I had another slide there, but I don't. One of the things I will say about scarring, particularly in work we do with schools, schools ask us when students should cover up scars and cover up wounds. We would say that wound care should be the same as any other wound care and treated in exactly the same way. And, you know, there's not a fuss made about it. You medically treat the wound and that's that. When it comes to scarring, asking people to cover up their scars can be quite detrimental to the recovery process. So if people have gotten to a point where they no longer wish to conceal their scars, so this person here is like years later, it's like, it's hot, I want to wear a vest. There might be a process in thinking through, well, what impact is that going to have? How am I going to respond to people staring? How am I going to respond to comments that are made? But it can be a really empowering experience for somebody to make that decision and say, no, I'm not going to conceal my scars anymore. So forcing somebody to cover them up can take that agency away and convey the message that there's something wrong with you. It gets into this idea of contagion, which is a word we don't use, but really, again, comes to that, back to that medicalized, there's something wrong with you, you can't infect the other people around you, and sends some really negative messaging to people who are trying to navigate their way through their own identity and their own relationship with their scarring. Self-acceptance. We are very good at being compassionate to other people and very bad at being compassionate to ourselves. So we like to take a more self-compassionate approach to supporting people who self-injure. Particularly for young people, we would say, you know, how would you treat a friend who is going through this tough time? So, you know, somebody might be being bullied, somebody's not doing so well at work, or they've lost their job. What would you say to that friend? How would you treat them? Why can't you treat yourself the same way? Turn that phrasing back onto yourself. You know, it's not your fault that you lost the job. The business is going through a redundancy process. It's not you. It's not personal, whatever it might be. Compassionate writing or using a gratitude journal sometimes helps. Sometimes this can just be a cathartic process just to get all the thoughts and feelings out. But when we ask people to write something good about themselves, that increases positive mood. So when compared to just journaling what happened during the day, compared to writing gratitude thoughts or self-compassionate thoughts, the gratitude journal and the self-compassion bring back some of that positivity into somebody's experience. And while I'm on that, we talk a lot about intense negative emotions and intense negative emotions feeding self-injury. I flagged earlier that intense positive emotions are just as important, can be just as challenging. A lot of the work we're doing is showing that it's not the presence of negative emotion that's the problem, it's the lack of positive emotion. And that when we put people in a lab situation and we stress them out, people who self-injure react in exactly the same way as people who don't. So they get the same negative reaction to being stressed out, but they take a bit longer to come back to baseline. So over time, if they have a negative experience, they're slower to come back to baseline, they get another negative experience, they go up again, a bit slower to come back. So over time, these repeated negative events can build up into something that's overwhelming. What seems to offset that is just little shots of positivity through the day. So little bursts of positive affect, and that might be part of that savoring positive things. It might be spending time with the dog or spending time with siblings or, listening to music, but really sort of being in that moment and savoring that and experiencing that as a positive thing can help offset some of that negative escalation. We know criticism is really common among people who self-injure. There's a lot of negative self-talk. I'm worthless, I'm hopeless, I'm fat, I'm ugly, I will never achieve anything, I'm a burden on everyone else. There's a lot of negative talk. We want to be able to change that talk. And instead of using that criticism, that negative self-talk as a motivator, we use goal setting as a motivator. So it might be, for example, if somebody's going, I'm fat, I'm ugly, I'm overweight, I'm just worthless. Rather than going, I have to go to the gym or I have to get on the treadmill because I'm fat and horrible, it might be reframing that to go, I'd like to become healthier and to set positive goals towards becoming healthier. So we're not feeding that self-criticism, but rather having that positive goal, small manageable goals that can be rewarded, and successes can be rewarded along the way. And taking care of the caregiver. So I'll come back to more of that probably on the next slide. But as people who care for people with BPD or people who are engaging in self-injury, it's important that you guys look after yourselves as well. It's that put your own oxygen mask on first situation. Sorry. Okay. So impact on carers and families. Caregivers, families have a huge role to play in self-injury in a number of different ways. Families can incur risks for self-injury. So children who come from families that have a disrupted family structure, where the parents have their own mental health struggles, where the relationship quality is not so great, where there are adverse childhood experiences, these can all feed into increasing risk of self-injury. They're not direct relationships. It's not that, mum has a mental health concern, therefore daughter will self-injure. A lot of mediators in that process. But these are sort of some of the socio-demographic things that we can say in this environment, there might be an increased risk of self-injury. Young people in particular are more likely to seek help from friends than they are from family, which means that parents are often not aware of if their child is self-injuring. I'm assuming most people on this call are aware of somebody they know who self-injures, but when we worked with adolescents, we asked them if they self-injured, we asked parents if their child self-injured, and where there was a mismatch, where the parent was unaware, the parent said their family functioning was perfectly fine, and the adolescent went, no, family functioning is not good. So there's a real disconnect in the child feeling unsupported and feeling like the family environment was quite unhelpful, while the parents were blissfully unaware, thinking everything was fine. When the parents and child come together, when they're both aware of what's going on and they're able to talk about it, then the family and family functioning can improve in that situation. There have been interventions that have been developed to include a parent component. Most of those are in Europe, so I'm not sure of anything that's really available here. But I've got colleagues in Belgium that have been doing some family therapy involving caregivers and the young people who self-injure, and sort of working on some communication techniques, getting people to more openly talk to each other in less judgmental or less emotional ways, so it's not a heated discussion. And that seems to have benefits for both the caregivers and the people involved in that study. And of course, having a child or knowing somebody who's self-injures can impact the family relationship and family dynamics as well. So siblings we talk to feel like their sibling gets much more attention, that they're stepping on eggshells around their sibling, that they're kind of a bit left out. Parents can feel guilty, and I'll get to some of that in a minute. And developmentally appropriate parenting may be exacerbated. So there was a comment or a question around the setting of boundaries and saying to a a young person, no, you can't do that. It's not safe for you to do that. Or, no, you're not going to go spend the night with a boy I haven't met yet. And putting those developmentally normal boundaries in place where a young person may then react to that and, how dare you tell me what to do? I hate you, slam the door and self-injure. Those kinds of pushing of boundaries, asserting independence, if we're talking about adolescents, is normal adolescent behavior. It's adolescents who are trying to become more independent, to find their identity, to break away from that family unit, to spend more time with their friends, to explore sexual relationships. And self-injury on top of that can be very, very challenging for caregivers, particularly if it's used as a threat. You have to let me go to this party or I'll self-injure. And I acknowledge that can be very, very tricky and very distressing for caregivers to be in that situation. I'm not going to have all the answers for that one, I'm afraid, but we do acknowledge that, particularly if we're talking about adolescents, that those developmentally normal challenges can be a lot harder when self-injury is thrown into the mix. I would highly recommend getting your hands on this book, Healing Self-Injury. So this is written by two of my colleagues in the US, and it's specifically for parents and caregivers. I believe it's the only book on self-injury that's solely for parents and caregivers. And it's a very positive book. It starts off with essentially saying, no, you're not a bad parent. No, you've picked up this book. That's obvious sign that you're not a bad parent. You're willing to learn, you're willing to engage to better understand what's going on for the person you care about. One of the things I will say about working with people who self-injure, whether it's adolescents or not, is that your response to them is really important in how they feel and how they might react to you. So we would say, obviously, we don't want to be judgmental. We don't want to be punitive. You want to validate what the young person is experiencing. So yes, I appreciate that you want to go to that party. I know that you want to spend time with your friends. However, I'm concerned that X, Y, and Z, and I'd prefer that you stay here, rather than, no, you're not going, slam the door. We talk about respectful curiosity. So this is talking in a calm, low-key, dispassionate demeanor. So very calmly, genuine curiosity that, okay, I'm just going to sit back and listen. I want to hear your story. I'm not going to make assumptions about what's going on. I understand that people self-injure for a number of different reasons. I'm trying to understand what's going on for you. Could you share with me what goes on when you self-injure? Could you share with me what you're feeling when that happens? And then again, that's hard. That can be challenging, to sit with that and sort of put your own feelings on hold a little bit and not jump in and try and offer solutions. So I'd recommend role-playing that if you've got family or friends, where you can try some of this language and feeling that in your mouth, being able to say, okay, I just want to understand what's going on for you. Recognizing that they may not want to talk about it. So again, that might be, you don't understand, you have no idea what's going on in my life, slam the bedroom door. That's okay, as long as the person knows that you're available to talk to if they want to. So we don't want to push people into talking, but being able to start a conversation and say, look, I'm concerned about you. I can see that something's going on for you. I can see that you've been really distressed lately. I'm concerned about your self-injury because of X, Y, and Z. Just know that I'm here whenever you want to talk about it. And again, that low-key, dispassionate, respectful curiosity demeanor is really important. Recognizing that ambivalence. People who self-injure can feel shame in their own ambivalence. I think I mentioned before. So, I want to stop, but I still want to keep going. But why do I want to keep going if I really should stop? And why can't I stop? And what's wrong with me? So that can feed a cycle of shame as well. So recognizing that and saying, look, I know it's hard to stop. I know this is something that works really well for you. And I know it's difficult to find alternative strategies. But maybe we can put together a support plan and sit down and look at the support plan and see what we can do. Recognizing your own reactions. So again, it's common to have reactions and your own feelings around supporting somebody who self-injures. People who in that supportive role can be put in a very difficult situation of feeling like they're trying to keep somebody safe, but having somebody who doesn't necessarily feel like they can keep themselves safe, or that doesn't want to stop self-injuring. So it's important, again, in your own self-care to recognize those emotions, to recognize that they're perfectly valid and perfectly normal to have, but maybe you want to debrief with a friend rather than with the person you're supporting. When we talk to parents about their experiences of having a child who self-injures, they talk about the impact on them, on their physical health and their emotional health. So they talked about getting heart palpitations, feeling sick, insomnia or fatigue. They talk about being worried, having anxiety, hypervigilance over their child, feeling shame, feeling like a bad parent. You know, why didn't I see this before? Why my child? What's wrong with my child? What's wrong with my parenting? So all of those kinds of things came up a lot in the parents we spoke to. And they also talked about changes in the relationship and the family dynamics in their family. So I talked about this increased vigilance, a lack of trust, the power dynamics. So again, I talked about that setting normal adolescent boundaries of no, you can't go sleep over at a boy's house. You know, how do you manage that conflict? How do you manage that relationship and still build a solid parent-child relationship in that context of self-injury? We also saw parents talk about self-injury bringing them closer to their child. So it's definitely brought us closer and strengthened our relationship, but would not recommend the experience to anyone. But taking the positives out of being able to say, well, we were able to sit down and communicate better, and this has helped us form a better bond through that open communication. And parents modifying their own behaviour. So not putting burdens on people, but at the same time, we don't want to remove developmentally appropriate tasks. So it's not like they don't have to do the dishes anymore, or they don't have to walk the dog anymore. They're still expected to engage with the family and engage in those developmentally appropriate family tasks. A colleague of mine talks about parental secondary stress. And again, I'm using the term parent as an inclusive, all friends, families, partners, siblings. And this can be objective strain felt through financial pressures, if there's counselling, for example, or trips to ED. Feeling that resentment, feeling embarrassed, that subjective feeling of strain. And what I talked about before in terms of that internalized strain of feeling guilty, feeling worried. Parents report more judgment of both themselves and their child than parents who don't have children with a history of self-injury, and they feel less optimism for the future. And this is more likely to occur if the parent is blaming themselves for self-injury and if the self-injury is more severe. So taking that self-compassionate approach for carers is really important, to recognize that you didn't cause this behavior, that you're not responsible for this behavior, that it doesn't mean that you're a bad parent or a bad friend. And so being able to use some of that reframing on yourself to go, well, hang on, you know, I'm not Superman. I can't change everything. I can be supportive. I can be non-judgmental. I can be there to listen, but I can't fix everything. Okay, getting to the end. I know you can't read this because it's all blurry. One of my roles many years ago was to set up the International Consortium on Self-Injury in Educational Settings. So that's an international group of researchers, clinicians, school psychologists, students, people with lived experience that focus specifically on NSSI in schools and university settings. So as part of that, we've put out quite a few resources for parents and carers. And this is one of them, where we've just got helpful and unhelpful strategies for parents. I've sent all of these to Belinda, so she can circulate those, and you can get the actual PDF files that you can print out or read or throw in the trash. But there are a lot of resources like this out there, which I know are not widely publicised. And I'll give you some links where you can find those in a minute. So again, coming back to self-care, being mindful of your own reactions, setting boundaries. So you need to set your own boundaries about supporting somebody who self-injures. You can't be there 100% all the time. You know, it may not be appropriate to call you up at 3 o'clock in the morning. So working with that person who self-injures to identify when it's okay to call, when it's okay to look for that support, what the extent of that support may be. So it might be that one particular friend is available to go to the movies, but doesn't want to get into deep and meaningful conversations. Another person is happy to talk about self-injury, but only within these timeframes. Whatever's going to work in your situation. And again, coming back to who's in the room, what's that relationship like? What is best for you and the person who self-injures. Taking time for yourself, taking that self-compassionate approach. What would you tell a friend who's in the same situation? Can you turn that back onto you? You would likely say to a friend, it's not your fault. Can you bring that back to you and say, it's not my fault? I'm doing all that I can. It's a really stressful time. It's not surprising that I'm anxious, but I'm doing everything I can to support this person. And seeking support for your own needs, okay? Talking to friends, talking to colleagues, talking to other people who know somebody who self-injures. This is really important because you're not going through this alone. That's one of the things that used to come out a lot in interviews with people who self-injure, is they always thought they were the only one engaging in this behavior, and they're not. And we're seeing that increasingly as we talk about it more, that people are recognizing that they're not alone, that they're not the only one who self-injures. And every single one of those people has a parent, a carer, a sibling, a friend, a partner who's involved in that as well. So it's great to see some peer support networks set up for people who care about people who self-injure. So these are the resources that I would recommend. SIOS is Self-Injury Outreach and Support. That's a Canadian-based website. At the moment, I'm going to take over soon, that provides a lot of resources for families, carers, people who self-injure. There are stories of recovery on there, which we know are associated with feeling better. Lots of handouts, lots of booklets for lots of different people. Self-Injury Recovery and Resources is a site based at Cornell University in the US. And again, lots and lots of resources for everyone, every single person that comes in contact with somebody who self-injures. There is, that won't be relevant, but take a look because their abundance of resources is just immense. The International Society for the Study of Self-Injury doesn't have as many resources, but is a great network of researchers and clinicians and people with lived experience working in the space of self-injury. We're trying to do more advocacy work. So if that's something that you're interested in doing more sort of lived experience, advocacy, outreach work, I'd love to hear your ideas on how we can do that in that international setting. Our international conference is next week in Vienna, and we have a specific session just looking at stigma, lived experience, how can we incorporate that better within the organisation. So there's Janice and Elizabeth's book, which, as I said, I would highly recommend, and the shameless self-plug for my book, which goes through a little bit about what self-injury is, relationship to suicide. It talks about traditional models of care and then delves into that experience of self-injury. So what does recovery look like, the recovery framework, how do we apply person-centered approaches to social media, to schools, to families, to intervention, and how do we advocate for a person-centered approach? So the entire book is underpinned by lived experience, and I believe it's the first book of its kind that is driven by a lived experience approach rather than that top-down, we're researchers, we know better than you approach, really embracing that lived experience bottom-up view. So that's me. There's my email address. As I said, more than happy to take any questions or suggestions that anyone might have via email. And we have some time now to answer any questions that you have.
Thanks, Penny. I've opened up the chat now if anyone wants to send through some questions. Just before we get into the question time, I would just like to make a little spiel about our organisation. All of our programs and webinars are run entirely by our dedicated team of volunteer leaders across Australia, and we currently receive no government funding and rely entirely on the generosity of donations from the community in order to continue operating and delivering as many free programs and events as we can to families and needs. And we'd like to ask you if you found any value in today's presentation. Would be so appreciative if you could consider supporting us with a pay as you feel donation. And I'll just put a little donation link in the chat here. Has anyone got any further questions?
Okay, so to answer the first question about the 2 peak onsets and whether there's a chance of a second peak reoccurring, the data I was referring to is really about the age somebody is at when they first self-injure. So for most people, that's around 12 to 14, but we do see this second peak onset of the first time somebody self-injures in their 20s. So I guess that was really around countering the myth that only adolescents self-injure, when we have quite a number of people in their 20s self-injuring for the very, very first time. Having said that, yes, it's entirely possible that somebody may self-injure through their adolescence and then stop for a while and then encounter another overwhelming situation and return to that behaviour. And that's part of that non-linear process of recovery, that somebody may go years and years and years without self-injury, but then something happens that brings them back to that as a trusted, proven coping strategy. Okay, lots of questions coming in now. Living in a rural area, yes, that's incredibly tricky. There's very little help generally, I think, when we're talking specifically about self-injury. There's a lot of myths and a lot of things that people just don't know a lot, even within the medical services that we have and the healthcare services that have. As I said, I would love to get a support group together, either online or face-to-face or a combination of both, to allow people to communicate and find that peer support. And that's something that's kind of on my agenda for the future, and sort of looking at how we can support carers of people who self-injure. Child has a lack of wanting to help themselves most of the time. I don't think that's unusual. I think that can also be quite developmentally normal, of, you know, I don't want to do this, I don't want to try, it's too hard. I would be thinking about having a discussion around what is going on for them. One of the tools that we use carefully, you need to be very careful with it, is a decisional balance. And here we would talk about what are the advantages of self-injuring, what are the disadvantages of self-injury, what are the advantages of reducing that behaviour, what are the disadvantages of reducing that behaviour. And that can be used in 2 ways. One, to identify that ambivalence, to recognise that, hang on, there are pros and cons to this behaviour, and there are pros and cons to reducing this behaviour, and that's normal. It's expected that you would have pros and cons. That ambivalence is a real thing. It could also be used to help shift that decision-making towards behaviour change, in which case you want to spend less time on the pros of self-injury and more time on the cons of self-injury and the pros of stopping or changing that behaviour. And then looking at what's important in those columns. So it might be that the disadvantage of stopping self-injury is no longer having it as a coping mechanism, but the advantage of stopping in terms of not upsetting people anymore, of being physically healthier, of reducing scarring, might be more important to that person, and you can build on that as a means of trying to shift that wanting to change, or sort of shift that decision making. Putting away the razor. So I would say no. We don't recommend trying to reduce access to means for a number of reasons. One is there are always means. So if it's not a razor, there'll be something else. And people are very, very creative. And when it comes down to it, fingernails work really well. So you're never going to be able to remove all possible means of self-injury. The second reason is people need to learn to live in a world that has all of these objects. So by taking them away, we're not fostering that coping strategy or fostering an ability to live in a world that has all of these objects. People are going to need to cut up their vegetables for dinner. If we take the knives away, how are we going to be encouraging people to make their own dinner? Having said that, if the injury is really medically serious, so if they're using methods that are potentially lethal or really medically serious, then you might want to limit access to those. So if somebody is overdosing, for example, on paracetamol or something and taking really quite extreme doses, then maybe you want to keep the paracetamol locked behind closed doors. But as a general rule, I wouldn't be putting away razors. References for articles, I can absolutely send those to Belinda. There'll be a long list of them. In fact, I can send you the actual articles because some of them will be behind a paywall.
Yep, that's fantastic. Thanks, Penny.
And yes, I can send that article on These Things Don't Work. Okay. Okay, won't want to talk to anyone. And I think that comes back to not pressuring people to talk. We can't force people to talk. They may want to talk about something else. You might start a discussion with how was your day, but letting them know that you are there, that if they do hit a point where they go, actually, I'm not coping so well, that they know that there's a safe space there for them to talk. Or encouraging them to talk to somebody else. Maybe it is a friend. Maybe it's a school counsellor. Maybe it's somebody else that they feel comfortable talking to. To share a bit of my own story, my brother has been going through a lot of stuff over the last 12 years. He doesn't self-injure, but mum is always very worried about it. But he talks to me daily. So mum's had to learn to sort of let go and say, as long as he's talking to you, that's okay. So it may be that there's somebody else that is around that is trusted that person can talk to. Someone who self-injures, who a sudden urge to get a lot of tattoos be of concern, it would come back to why. So why do they want to get a lot of tattoos? Some people use tattoos to cover scarring, and there are some tattoo parlors that will actually do that for free. So they may cover scars with encouraging messages or with tattoos that bring them hope or optimism as part of their recovery process. I wouldn't see getting tattoos as a form of self-injury, but I would be asking what the underlying motivation is. Is it about expressing themselves as an individual, in which case I wouldn't see that there's a problem with it? Is it about tattooing messages of recovery or of optimism, in which case, if that works for them, great. But to find out what's going on. Parents can definitely talk about developing a recovery plan. So the Beyond Now app is designed to be used by anyone. And as I said before, it may be parents who are best placed to identify what those alternative coping strategies are. Or, you went for a swim yesterday and you seem to be in a really great mood. Is that something you want to do more of? So absolutely, that can be done together. And I've used it with people before in suicide crisis and also not in suicide crisis. And going through it, they're like, oh, I hadn't thought of that. And I hadn't thought of this before, and find it quite beneficial to have that plan as a bit of a safety net that they know they can pull out. And the good thing about the Beyond Now one is also it can be updated. So, if they find something else that works for them, or they've got a new friend, or they don't want a friend listed there anymore, they can modify that plan. As a physio, I would not comment on evidence of self-injury unless the person brought it up themselves. So people may have obvious cuts or burns and they're trying to cover it up. Certainly with adults, I wouldn't approach it. I just, it's not my job to point it out. It's not my job to say anything. It's the individual story. And if they want to tell it, they will. With children, I don't know what age we're talking about it. If we're talking about talking to parents, again, I probably wouldn't. The partner is likely to know. So intimate partners almost always know what's going on. With parents, I think it needs to come down to your ethical responsibilities in your profession and what your guidelines are around confidentiality. But if they allow to maintain that confidentiality, then the young person is going to feel a lot safer coming back to the physio. They're going to be highly anxious anyway, knowing that their scars are going to be observed. So they're likely to be highly anxious going in. They're highly reluctant to be there. If it can be made to be a safe space where they're not being judged or called out on it, that's going to make for a much better relationship. Okay, schools. Don't get me started. I have a whole soapbox for schools and contagion. So I do a lot of work with schools, but it's not enough. We talk about, yes, some people get to the idea to self-injure from friends, but we have some research that shows that knowing somebody who self-injures is not associated with any self-injury at all, unless that person is going through their own significant psychological distress. So it's not a matter of, I know somebody who self-injures, therefore I'm going to self-injure too. They're using it, they may get the idea from someone else, but they're using it as a coping strategy for their own stuff that's going on. I have a number of policy documents and papers around how schools can approach self-injury. And how it should be a whole of school approach, and people should not be sent home, and we shouldn't be asking people to cover up scars. But at the same time, we want to approach self-injury from a holistic coping strategy perspective. So there are lots of different ways that people cope with stress or with exams or anxiety. Some people self-injure. We don't mention method. So we never ever go into different methods. We never have images or detailed discussions of self-injury. There's no sensationalizing it by saying, oh, but these celebrities self-injure. So it's very much that low-key, factual, this is something some people do, it's just a coping strategy, and here are lots of others that you could use instead. And to be honest, when I first moved to Perth 10 years ago, I met with a school trying to establish some professional networks, and I was told that they send home every single person that self-injures. And I'm like, that's 10% of your school. You can't possibly be sending everyone home. But it was really, they had head in the sand approach and just didn't want to see it. So yes, I'm trying, but we need to do a lot more with schools. There's really very, very little work on primary school students. I'm aware of a paper that's currently under review that shows that self-injury among primary school students is much the same as it is amongst high school students. It's the same reasons. Teachers and staff have the same concerns and the same fears. Ethics committees are very reluctant to talk about self-injury with primary school children. So that's a bit of a challenge in trying to progress that space. Self-injury and autism, yes, there is a relationship. No, I haven't looked at it. So I've got a colleague who works in the autism space, and we're constantly saying we need to get together and do something, but it hasn't happened yet. So I don't have an answer for you on that one either. Okay, is covering up a deep and fresh scar appropriate when triggering to other adolescents? Other residents? Yes, but I would approach that from not a being forced to cover up, but other people may feel triggered by this. We use this approach in schools. So with adolescents, you're able to say, some of your friends might be upset seeing this particular wound. You don't want to upset your friends. Adolescents care more about their friends than anyone else. So if we're able to couch it in that way of, this isn't about covering up, or demeaning your story. This is about trying to make sure other people aren't put in a vulnerable position. So I would be working on the framing of that so that it's not a shaming thing, but you're giving them the option. I would make it voluntary, so not forcing people to cover up, but putting the concerns on the table and seeing what people say in response to that. I would also be talking to the person about what happens if they no longer conceal scars. So how are they going to react when somebody else feels triggered or feels vulnerable or comments on it? Language phrasing. Okay, so what to do with a person who's injured to point of stitches, but they're in denial and don't acknowledge the wound is severe? Could not convince her to go to a doctor. Yep, that's more common than not. And I think partly because of shame, partly because of not wanting to talk about it, partly because our healthcare system is a complete mess, including very highly stigmatizing, and people get terrible treatment in ED. So I can understand entirely why people don't want to go. I think we can talk first aid. So we can talk basic first aid, but we could also talk about putting in place some, I hate to use the word boundaries, but for lack of better terminology, to talk about when is this hitting a point where we need to get professional support. And again, using that empathic, look, I understand why it's scary to go to ED or why you don't want to, but I'm concerned that this might get infected. I think we need to go in and get it stitched up and try and approach it that way. And if you can have an idea of, well, if it's going to need stitches, then we go and need to see somebody, but done in a way that is not going to result in that person concealing it from you. So that's also a worry if you say we're going to have to go to ED, that they may not tell you. So everything's coming down to communication. Yep, so I don't have to agree with what they're thinking, but acknowledging her pain is real. So when I talk about validating emotions, that's not validating the behavior, but it's, or accepting the behavior, or you know, supporting the behavior. It's supporting the person and validating what's going on for them. So it's not encouraging the behavior, it's supporting the individual and recognizing them. Worthlessness affects school attendance. Yes, it does. I'm not sure what else to say about that. Okay, same thing, refusing to get treatment. Kids are coping better than adults when talking to each other. I think that's probably true. I think there probably is an element of, no, the adults don't understand. I hear a lot, this didn't happen when I was at school. But yes, it did. You just didn't know about it. Yep, sometimes it's not helpful to point out the link with self-injury. Sometimes people don't want to think about themselves as somebody who self-injures because that comes with a lot of stigma. And in fact, we interviewed somebody who was a young adult, had stopped self-injury. We were talking about what helped them stop the behavior and looking back. And this was a person who used to bang her head on walls until somebody sort of pointed out to her that that was a form of self-injury. And she's like, no, it's not. That's what those emo kids do. That's not me. And that shift in identity was part of the reason that she stopped, is because she didn't want to be identified as somebody who's self-injured. So, you know, in that example, it was a good thing to sort of bring that there and raise it. But I think it can also be incredibly labeling and stigmatizing to say somebody might be self-injuring. So that's where I would come back to, you know, it's quite a common strategy to cope with stress. It's not surprising that you're doing this. Okay, so 2 more if I've got time.
Yep, do 2 more.
Has mobile phone use escalated the behaviour? We haven't seen an increase in the behaviour. What we've seen with social media, for example, is that it's both a good thing and a bad thing. So people will use social media to seek belonging, to seek out like-minded people who understand what they're going through, to get tips for recovery, to hear recovery stories, all of which is very helpful. The vast majority of sites out there are in that kind of space. There's not really anything like the pro-ANA movement in self-injury. There's nothing that's encouraging NSSI. On the other hand, we know that seeing very graphic images or very graphic descriptions can be triggering for people. So we would discourage any of that material being made available, but encourage people to use sites that offer stories of recovery, stories of hope, and sharing their experiences. And the last one, is it linked to habitual addictive behaviour thought? The short answer is no. There are some similarities, but there are quite a few differences. Having said that, some people will refer to the behaviour as addictive. And this is where we come back to using the person's own language. So if somebody says, you know, I feel addicted to my self-injury, I wouldn't jump in and go, no, 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 it's not an addiction. I'd be using their own language, but I'd be exploring what is it that makes you think it's addictive? And, you know, I can't not act on the urge. Well, okay, how are we going to address that? And we'd go back to finding alternatives and emotional awareness and that urge surfing kind of stuff. But there are a lot of differences between the two that we really don't have time to go into, but happy if you shoot me an email and I can, again, refer you to some stuff that show you how it's different. I think I got through most of them.
I think you did. Wow, congratulations. That was a fantastic session. And that wraps up our webinar for today. We hope you all have enjoyed today's presentation and gained some understanding and knowledge about NSSI. Thank you so much to our wonderful presenter, Penny, for her wonderfully informative and compassionate presentation and for sharing her time and knowledge with us today. And thank you all to our audience for your